He should have been dead 10 times over before his wheels ever touched that runway. One American pilot, one battered, outdated P-40, 64 Japanese aircraft coming in like a steel storm, and a burning engine that refused to quit. At 8,000 feet, his cockpit was filling with smoke, his coolant was gone, his oil pressure read zero, and the controls that were supposed to save his life were trying to kill him instead. So he did the one thing no sane pilot would ever do. He flipped his dying fighter upside down and tried to fly it home inverted. This isn't a movie. This happened over the forgotten jungles of the China-Burma-India theater, on a day when the life of one young lieutenant meant the survival of thousands of men on the ground who never even knew his name. You're about to hear how Philip Adair broke every rule of flying shredded, every survival instinct, and still refused to let go of that control stick. If you're watching this on WW2 Secrets, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you first heard, if you ever heard this story at all. At 9:27 a.m. on December 13th, 1943, the sky over Assam looked deceptively calm, just a pale curtain of winter haze drifting above the jungle. Then, like ghosts materializing out of nothing, 64 Japanese aircraft slid into view 3 miles east of Denjin Airfield. From the cockpit of his lone P-40 Warhawk, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair saw them before anyone else did. He tightened his grip on the stick. It wasn't fear that hit him first. It was the cold certainty that he was the only man in the air, and everything below him now depended on a single engine and a pair of trembling wings. Adair was 23, but the war aged men fast. He had flown 43 combat missions for the 89th Fighter Squadron, running protection for the legendary Hump airlift, a lifeline carved through the Himalayas feeding China's resistance against the Japanese. Every crate, every gallon of fuel flown over those mountains meant soldiers could keep fighting. And every C-47 waiting on the ground at Denjin was part of that fragile artery. 14 transports were parked neatly on the tarmac that morning, each one loaded for Chiang Kai-shek's forces. Nearby, a field hospital nursed 63 wounded men. Just beyond it, fuel drums stacked in rows held 11 days' worth of supply for an entire front. If the bombers reached the field, none of it would survive the hour. For 8 brutal weeks, Japanese raiders had been hammering Allied airfields across northeastern India, destroying 47 transports on the ground, killing over 100 personnel, knocking holes in the airlift that no engineer could patch. Morale was cracking. You could feel it in the hushed conversations at breakfast, the nervous glances toward the jungle. The men at Denjin knew the next raid could be the one that finally snapped the chain, linking India to China. And now, here it was. 24 Ki-21. Sally bombers in a disciplined stream, escorted by roughly 40 Ki-43 Oscar fighters, stacked in perfect layers above and below them, gliding forward at 240 mph. They were still 3,000 feet beneath him, unaware that a single American fighter hung like a hawk above their formation. Reinforcements from Jorhat were 38 minutes away. 38 minutes was a lifetime and also an eternity too long. Adair glanced at his gauges. 180 gallons of fuel, 90 minutes of flight time at combat power, enough bullets for 12 seconds of fire. Lulu Bell, his battered but loyal Warhawk, was all he had. Doctrines drilled into every Allied fighter pilot warned never to engage when outnumbered more than 5 to 1. Philip Adair faced 64 to 1. He could call for help and shadow the formation. Wait, buy time, survive. But by the time friendly fighters reached the field, the Sallies would already have released their loads, 250 pounds of destruction per aircraft, onto the hospital, the transports, the fuel, the men. Adair knew what the manual said. But the manual wasn't the one looking down at a runway full of people who trusted a pilot in the sky to keep death away from them. He pushed the throttle forward. The Allison engine roared, the manifold pressure rising to 54 inches. Lulu Bell began to climb sun at her back, her pilot choosing the impossible over doing nothing at all. The choice had already been made the moment Adair shoved the throttle forward, long before his mind caught up to what his hands were doing. Doctrine said disengage. Survive. Wait for the squadron. But Doctrine had never looked a few thousand feet down at 14 helpless transports, lined up in neat rows like offerings, or at a hospital tent where wounded men lay, listening to the distant hum of engines they hoped were friendly. Up here, survival wasn't the point. Denjon surviving was. Lulu Bell responded to the command like a hunting dog released from its leash. Her nose lifted, her engine screamed in a raw, metallic howl, and she surged toward 320 mph as Adair eased her into position 4,000 feet above the Japanese bombers, sliding in from the south with the sun blazing behind him. The Oscars would be looking forward, focused on the target. No one ever expected an attack this far, out 20 miles from the airfield. That distance was supposed to be safe airspace for the bombers, a place where escorts relaxed, where formation leaders allowed themselves a moment of comfort. Adair intended to shatter that comfort. He felt the tension winding through his body, a coil ready to snap. Not fear focus. He could hear the voice of his instructor from months ago, somewhere back in the States. If you're outnumbered, go for the head. Take out the lead ship and the body falls apart. It was true for wolves, for armies, and for aerial formations. Below him, the lead group of 6 Ki-21 Sally bombers flew in 2 tight Vs of 3 aircraft. Beautiful in their precision. Predictable. Vulnerable. He rolled Lulu Bell inverted in one smooth motion, the horizon flipping, as if someone had torn the world from its hinges. With the sun behind him, he was just a dark silhouette if anyone saw him at all. The nose came down, gravity grabbed hold, and the P-40 plunged like a thrown spear. The numbers on the airspeed indicator began to blur. 350, 360. Faster. The frame of the Warhawk vibrated with a rising whine, part engine, part wind, part tension. At 800 yards, Adair opened fire, the 6. 50 caliber Brownings answered with a thunderous metallic roar, their tracers carving bright orange strokes across the sky toward the left wing of the lead Sally. The effect was instant and violent. Cloth tore open skin panels, burst like kicked tin, and sparks crawled across the nacelle before the port engine erupted in a sheet of blaze. The bomber jerked sideways, a giant staggering midstep, and then the entire formation buckled as pilots swerved instinctively away from the fireball. This was exactly what Adair needed: chaos. In a bombing run, the tightness of formation determined accuracy. Even the smallest disruption could turn a deadly precise strike into a spray of bombs scattered over useless jungle. And Adair hadn't just disrupted them, he'd blown their cohesion apart. He hauled back on the stick. 7 Gs slammed him into his seat, crushing the air from his lungs, as Lulu Bell clawed upward, rolling right to evade the oncoming escorts. The sky that had been quiet 1 heartbeat earlier exploded with motion, as more than 40 Ki-43 Oscars dove toward him, sunlight glinting off their wings like knives. Adair didn't panic. This was expected. The fighters were coming. The bombers were broken, at least for now. And the real fight was only just beginning. They came at him like a swarm of metal hornets, 40 Ki-43 Oscars, dropping out of the sky with predatory grace, their silhouettes slicing through the haze. To anyone who had fought them before, that shape meant one thing: danger at close quarters. The Oscar was the knife fighter of the Pacific, a plane that could twist and pivot with a kind of impossible elegance. Lightweight, fabric-skinned, armed modestly, but in the hands of a skilled Japanese pilot, it was a scalpel aimed straight at the heart of any Allied fighter. Adair knew their reputation well. In the past 6 months alone, Oscars had shot down 63 Allied aircraft in Burma and Northeast India. Pilots described them with a bitter respect. If you try to turn with an Oscar, you die. Simple as that. Lulu Bell, his P-40N, was a different creature entirely. Heavier, faster built like a clenched fist instead of a dancing blade. She possessed straight-line speed and rugged bones, but in a turning fight, she bled energy like an open wound. The Allison engine under her long nose could deliver 140 horsepower at full combat power, pushing her to 378 mph, below 12,000 feet. But horsepower didn't matter if an Oscar slid onto your tail and carved you apart with 7.7mm fire before you could point your guns in its direction. The textbooks were clear hit and run dive, and climb, never circle with them. Use speed as your shield. Reset the fight before the Oscar could draw you into its deadly turning dance. But the textbooks had never accounted for this moment. For this sky filled with 24 bombers, still clawing to reform, for 14 transport planes on the ground, counting on him alone. Adair couldn't extend away. If he fled, the Sallies would stitch themselves back into their tight, perfect Vs and rain destruction across Denjon. So instead of running, he dove right back into the chaos, determined not to kill the Oscars, but to keep them busy, to keep the bombers scattered, to stall time itself until reinforcements arrived. The first 4 Oscars came at him from his 10 o'clock high in a loose, finger-4 formation. He rolled left, pulled Lulu Bell's nose up, and fired a quick 2-second burst. The tracers cut the air cleanly, but missed. The lead Oscar peeled right, his wingman following, disciplined and tight like dancers in a deadly choreography. 2 more Oscars dropped from above, their silver bellies flashing. Adair yanked the Warhawk into a climbing left turn, squeezing the stick until his arm trembled. Another burst, no hits. His ammunition counter ticked down to 800 rounds. Enough for maybe 6 more passes if he was careful. And careful wasn't good enough today, not with the bombers behind the Oscar screen, slowly stitching themselves back into 3 groups of 6. He stole a glance over his shoulder. Those Sallies were closing in again, patient and methodical, like a tide rolling back into formation. He could almost feel the seconds slipping through his fingers. 90 seconds. That's all he had before they reached the release point. So he shoved the throttle to the stop, leveled out, and dove straight toward the bombers again, the Oscars screaming after him in a descending pack. Lulu Bell accelerated past 400 mph, faster than any Oscar could safely chase. Speed was her one advantage, her sole shield in a sky filled with enemies. And Adair planned to use every last mile per hour of it. The world below him blurred into streaks of green and brown as Lulu Bell tore through the sky in a steep dive. The Oscars couldn't stay with him at this speed. Their wings vibrated dangerously, near the edge of structural failure. So in those precious seconds, Adair was alone with the bombers once again. The right-hand Sally formation had nearly regained its perfect V. Nearly. Close enough that one clean, decisive strike could ruin everything they'd just fought to rebuild. He leveled out at bomber altitude, lined the nose up with surgical precision, and fired. The tracers converged into a burning path that chewed straight through the right engine of the lead aircraft. The Mitsubishi HA-101 Radial detonated in a fireball, the blast ripping metal from its mounts, spitting shards into the slipstream. Flames trailed like a banner behind the bomber as it rolled away in a doomed spiral. Its wingman broke formation to avoid collision, a single instant of instinct, undoing minutes of discipline. Adair kicked hard left rudder, skidding Lulu Bell across the formation's flank. Another burst. The .50 caliber rounds punched through the Sally's thin aluminum skin like it was paper. The Ki-21, designed in the mid-1930s, had no armor plate for the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks, an old warhorse thrown into a newer, crueler sky. It could still carry more than a ton of bombs, enough to level an airfield, but its age showed the moment bullets found its belly. The formation buckled again. Another V dissolved into panicked lines. The bombers scattered, some climbing, some diving, some peeling out to the flanks. But even chaos carried a clock. 19 miles to Denjon became 17. 17 miles became minutes. Somewhere below that haze of fear and fire fuel drums sat in neat rows, a sparkling promise to any bomber looking for a clean hit. The hospital tents, vulnerable as a heartbeat. The transports, wingtip to wingtip, full of supplies, meant for men who might die without them. Adair knew exactly what those bombs would do. He'd seen it before, once in a different valley, where a single Ki-21 sail-bombed an airstrip and turned it into a wasteland, scorched earth scraps of aluminum fire crews, digging men out of the ruins. He could still hear the shouts in his memory, the throaty roar of flames eating through canvas, the sickening realization that the raid had cost more than just aircraft. This wouldn't happen again. Not on his watch. Not today. Then heat. A creeping, rising, clawing heat radiating through the airframe. Adair glanced at the gauges. Coolant temperature, 230 degrees F. Should have been 210. At 250, the Allison V-1710 would start to die. He'd been holding full combat power for 11 straight minutes longer than any sane pilot would. Longer than the engineers ever intended. The radiator beneath him gulped air that was too warm, too humid. The liquid coolant boiled like a kettle. Metal in the cylinders expanded toward seizure. He had three choices: reduce power and let the engine cool, leaving the bombers to regroup. Retreat and survive, letting Denjon burn. Or keep the throttle forward, carry on toward a failing engine, and gamble his life on one more attempt. He didn't hesitate. Lulu Bell surged forward again, even as her guts threatened mutiny. Then two Oscars flashed into view head-on, closing fast guns already blazing. Tracers zipped past his canopy, green-white and furious. At a combined speed of over 600 mph, there was no room for fear, no time for doubt. Adair squeezed the trigger. His heavier .50 caliber fire ripped into the lead Oscar, cracking open the engine cowling and sending the fighter veering off, trailing white coolant. The second Oscar, startled by the sudden ferocity, pulled away sharply. Adair rolled right and dove again. His coolant gauge hit 240 degrees F. The needle trembled like it wanted to scream. Below, the Sally formations were crumbling, one broken entirely. One scattered across miles of jungle, one struggling to realign. Their bombing accuracy was dead. Even if they dropped now, the pattern would fall in a useless sprawl. Adair had bought Denjon more than time. He'd bought it survival. But Lulu Bell was beginning to sound wrong. A deep vibration trembled through the stick. The engine coughed, shuddered, fought itself. She wasn't just overheated now. She was dying, and the fight was far from over. The first warning wasn't the sound, it was the shiver. A deep, uneven vibration crawled up through the control stick, like the Warhawk herself was whispering that something inside her had begun to tear loose. A split second later, the sky erupted in flashes as 8 Oscars dove on him from above their 7.7mm guns, stitching bright silver punctures across Lulu Bell's right wing. Fabric peeled back. Fabric peeled. Metal curled like it was made of paper. Then came the hit that mattered, the one that struck the right aileron control rod. Instantly, the stick went soft on one side, spongy and wrong. Adair pushed right, and the airplane barely listened. Another burst walked across the fuselage, sparks flaring off the engine cowling before one round found the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green glycol sprayed across the windscreen in a sickening fan, sizzling as it met the hot slipstream. His coolant gauge shot past 260 degrees F. Steam burst from the cowling seams. Oil pressure fell hard, the needle dropping like a stone toward zero. The Allison V-1710 was no longer overheating, it was actively eating itself alive. And then the engine caught fire. At first, it was a whisper of orange under the cowling, visible only in flashes. Then, like a beast tasting blood, it surged forward, carried by airflow along the engine's flanks. Adair knew exactly what came next. Every pilot trained on liquid-cooled engines did first coolant burns, then ignition spreads. Then it reaches the fuel lines, and when it does, game over, instantly. Standard procedure: shut down, bail out, trust your parachute. Pray the Japanese patrols didn't get to you first. But he wasn't at 15,000 feet on a clean escape path. He was at 8,000, descending fast, with the jungle waiting below like a vast green trap, and Japanese soldiers scattered through it like hidden teeth. If he bailed out here, he wouldn't last a day. And Denjon, still within reach of the broken Sally formations, would lose its only protector. So instead of killing the engine, he reached for the mixture control and did the unthinkable. He starved the fire. He yanked the mixture back to idle cutoff 1 Mississippi 2-3, and the Allison, coughed itself into a feeble sputter, choking the flames. Then, he slammed the mixture forward again. The engine shuddered back to life, wounded, uneven, but alive. Power output dropped to 60%. Barely enough to keep the plane level. But enough. It had to be enough. Beneath him, the last cohesive sally formation started to unravel. 13 miles from Denjon, the bombers scattered for home, no longer a weapon, just shards of a failed raid limping toward Burma. The airfield was safe for now, but the danger to Adair was only beginning. He turned southwest toward Nguli, 43 miles away. 15 minutes of flying time if the engine cooperated. An eternity if it didn't. At 7,000 feet, the oil pressure gauge bottomed out completely. A death sentence for any engine. Oil was life without it. Metal scraped, metal, heat soared, tolerances closed, pistons seized. For a moment, Adair imagined the inside of his engine glowing rods, grinding bearings, a crankshaft warping itself toward destruction. But the Allison kept turning, out of sheer stubbornness. Or maybe out of fellowship, pilot and machine, refusing to die alone. The Oscars trailing him tightened their circle. They didn't fire. They didn't need to. They were waiting for gravity to finish the job. At 400 yards, one Oscar slid alongside close enough that Adair could see the pilot's face, young, focused perhaps, even sympathetic. The Japanese pilot pointed downward, slowly, deliberately. Surrender. Land. Live. Adair stared back through the fog of smoke inside his canopy and did nothing. He wasn't giving up Lulu Bell. Not here. Not to anyone. At 6,000 feet, the cockpit began to fill with acrid smoke, not from the engine, but from behind the instrument panel. Electrical wiring burned where incoming rounds had severed bundles and scorched insulation. The fumes clawed at his throat, his eyes, his lungs. He slid the canopy open, letting a blast of wind clear the smoke, but the slipstream made breathing a battle of its own. His airspeed dipped to 160 mph. The Oscars backed away again, watching the damaged American fighter drift downward, like a wounded bird losing altitude, inch by inch. They weren't wasting ammunition. They weren't risking a close fight. To them, he was already dead. But Adair wasn't done. Not yet. Not while the engine still coughed out some semblance of power. Not while there was the faintest shadow of a chance to reach Nguli. Far below, a jungle waited. Above 6 patient killers circled. And ahead, somewhere past the haze, a runway waited for a miracle. At 4,000 feet, the Warhawk finally began to unravel in earnest. It started with a sharp metallic snap, so crisp, so clean, it cut through the roar of the slipstream like a rifle shot. The right aileron control cable parted. Not frayed. Not weakened. Snapped. Instantly, the aileron slammed to full deflection, yanking the right wing downward with the brutal simplicity of a lever forced by gravity itself. The P-40 rolled hard right. The nose dropped. Adair hauled back on the stick. Nothing. Pulled harder. Still nothing. The elevator cables were damaged too, barely responding, refusing to lift the nose in any meaningful way. The descent steepened. 200 mph. The jungle below expanded a rough, endless ocean of green that promised only one thing: if he hit it, obliteration. He should have panicked. Anyone would. But in the split second between life and death, Adair's brain did something far stranger. It became quiet, silent, focused. In that strange clarity, an idea surfaced, ridiculous and desperate, but real. If the damaged aileron forced the right wing down in level flight, then inverted, it would force the right wing up. If the elevator stuck in a nose-down trim fought him upright, then inverted, it might help him lift the nose. Aerodynamics cut both ways. He didn't have time to wonder if it would work. He didn't even have time to consider the consequences if it didn't. At 1,800 feet, barely 1 second from the point where survival becomes mathematically impossible, Adair rolled the P-40 upside down. The world inverted with him. The jungle became sky. The sky became jungle. Gravity slammed him into his harness with a sickening brain flooding. 1G. Blood rushed to his head so fast that the edges of his vision flushed red, like ink blooming in water. The engine sputtered violently. Its fuel system was designed for positive G-loads. Inverted fuel sloshed away from the pickup. The Allison coughed, nearly quit, then caught again in a ragged, uneven roar. But the nose. God bless the impossible, the nose stopped dropping. Then it rose. Not by much. Not by heroism's worth. But by inches. Enough to slow the descent. Enough to turn a deadly plunge into a controlled fall. 1,200 feet. 1,900. The P-40 leveled out upside down, flying at 140 mph, bleeding altitude but alive. Adair held it there, clinging to the inverted attitude for 40 excruciating seconds. His vision pulsed. His temples throbbed. He could feel his own heartbeat in his teeth. The plane climbed slowly, painfully 50 feet, as if dragging itself up a cliff by its fingernails. Then, the engine faltered again. Fuel starvation. It wouldn't stay fed, inverted. He had to roll upright. He rolled. Gravity flipped again. The controls immediately tried to kill him. The nose punched downward, stealing altitude like a thief. 600 feet per minute lost. Adair gritted his teeth, waited until he fell nearly 300 feet, and then did it again. Rotate, inverted, climb, roll, descend, repeat. A grotesque ballet of survival. A sequence no flight manual had ever dared describe. A rhythm of desperation carved into the sky by a man who refused to accept the numbers, the odds, the physics, or the fate that everyone else, including the 6 Japanese fighters circling overhead, believed was already sealed. And those Oscars, they watched. They watched this wounded American bird flip itself again and again, clawing upward each time like some stubborn animal refusing the ground. One Oscar broke formation and dove toward him for a closer look. Maybe curiosity. Maybe disbelief. Adair saw it coming. He rolled inverted, gaining altitude. Then rolled upright, nose pointed directly at the inquisitive Oscar. The Japanese pilot broke off instantly. Madness, courage, instinct, whatever drove Adair, it was enough to convince the enemy that this was not a man to corner. Moments later, the Oscars turned east toward Burma, leaving the sky to the lone battered Warhawk, who wouldn't die. Adair continued his rolling climb inch by inch. 3,000 feet. 4,000. Nguli airfield lay somewhere ahead, still distant, still impossible, but no longer unreachable. And Lulu Bell, running on 0 oil pressure, boiling coolant, shredded control surfaces, and sheer willpower kept flying. By the time Adair limped Lulu Bell up to 5,000 feet, the Allison engine had passed every mechanical limit ever intended for it. The coolant temperature gauge had given up entirely. The needle had melted off somewhere in the chaos. Oil pressure still read 0, not wavering, not flickering, just flat dead. Any engineer would have sworn the engine should have seized 10 minutes ago. But somehow, impossibly, the cylinders kept firing in ragged, tortured pulses, driven by the last traces of oil film clinging to metal, and the stubborn will of a pilot refusing to surrender. Then, through the haze and the pain pressing on his skull, Adair saw it. Nguli. A thin, pale gray runway cutting across the green world below, quiet and unsuspecting. Safety. Home. An end to the nightmare if he could reach it in time. If the engine held. If the controls didn't finally give out. If he didn't black out from the carbon monoxide seeping into his blood. Every if was a knife hanging over him by a thinning thread. But reaching the runway wasn't the finish line. It was the start of a new problem. When Adair reached down for the landing gear lever, his right hand trembled. Not fear poison. 14 minutes of inhaling electrical smoke had pumped carbon monoxide into his bloodstream, fogging his thoughts, tightening his chest. He pulled the gear lever down. Nothing. No clunks. No pressure. No movement. The Warhawk's landing gear was hydraulic. So were the flaps. Both depended on the engine-driven pump, and Adair's engine was barely alive. At such low power, the pump couldn't generate anywhere near the 1,000 psi she needed to force the gear down. And he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he couldn't land gear up. Not with a damaged belly full of fuel. Not in a machine already flirting with fire. The P-40 had a manual hand pump mounted low on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes to build enough pressure. But effective pumping required both hands. Letting go of the control stick meant letting the crippled aircraft obey its broken systems, nose down, right wing dropping death. Unless... Adair reached behind his seat with fumbling fingers, found his lap belt, unclipped it, wrapped it around the control stick, threaded it through the seat frame, pulled it tight until Lulu Bell held roughly level, like a wounded horse leaning on a post for support. Crude. Imperfect. But enough. He grabbed the hand pump with both hands and started working. 1, 2, 3 strokes. Nothing. 5, 10, 15. His breath rasped. The world narrowed into a gray tunnel around the edges. His vision swam. But the pumping continued because it had to. At the 23rd stroke, the handle resisted. Pressure. At 28, a heavy thunk echoed through the floorboards. One landing gear leg locked into place. 3 seconds later, the other followed. Relief didn't come. Couldn't. Gear down meant drag, massive drag. Lulu Bell slowed from 160 mph to 135 mph almost instantly. Still above stall speed, but barely. The engine produced maybe 40% power, now enough to keep her out of a stall if the air stayed smooth. If he held her steady. If he stayed conscious. Naguli was 7 miles ahead. 3 minutes. Adair blinked hard, trying to clear the gray fog creeping into his vision. Carbon monoxide poisoning wasn't a slow fade. It was a trapdoor. One moment you're fighting it. The next moment the world simply turns off. He shook his head, tasted iron, tasted smoke. 6 miles. The working temperature gauge, one of the only ones left, showed 310 degrees Celsius. Unthinkable. Every piston inside that engine was expanding beyond its design tolerance. At any moment, metal could weld to metal, a rod could snap, or the crankshaft could freeze. 5 miles. The tower operators spotted him, smoke trailing, wobbling in the air gear down. They assumed he would come in hot but steady. They assumed he still had flaps. He didn't. No flaps meant a landing speed of 120 mph rather than 90. On a 4,000-foot runway that left almost no room for error. He'd be hitting the ground like a stone, skipping across water. 2 miles. Then the engine quit. No sputter, no warning, just silence. A dead propeller windmilled lazily in the slipstream. Lulu Bell became a glider. A terrible glider. The P-40 had a glide ratio of roughly 8:1, and his wasn't even that good anymore. Bullet holes in the fuselage and wings tore at the airflow, creating drag he could feel in his bones. From 2,000 feet, a clean Warhawk might glide 3 miles. He had 2 miles to go, and with damage this severe, maybe 1.5. He was going to crash short. After fighting 64 Japanese aircraft, after flying inverted to survive, after nursing a dying engine for 15 agonizing minutes, he was going to die 200 yards from safety. Then, like a candle flickering alive in darkness, he remembered something. A training lecture. Barely a footnote. A throwaway comment about P-40 aerodynamics. Inverted glides sometimes reduce drag. Slightly. Maybe enough to matter. No one had ever used it in combat. No one was ever supposed to. Adair rolled Lulu Bell inverted at 1,800 feet. Blood rushed to his head. His vision blurred. The jungle slid across the top of his canopy. But the drag eased. The descent slowed from 700 feet per minute to 500. Marginal. Meager. But life is a creature of margins. Naguli's runway slid toward him slowly, achingly, yet somehow close enough to reach. If he could hold on. If he could stay awake. If physics gave him just one more miracle. At 400 feet inverted and bleeding altitude with every heartbeat, Adair was no longer flying a machine. He was wrestling a dying animal, coaxing it toward sanctuary by sheer force of will. The runway at Naguli stretched beneath him, except beneath was above, because the P-40 was still upside down. His vision tunneled gray, closing in like a tightening fist. Carbon monoxide and negative G-forces twisted his senses into something foreign and fragile. He had maybe 20 seconds of consciousness left, maybe less. On the ground, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez raised his binoculars and froze. An inverted P-40 gear down smoke, trailing drifting toward the field like a specter. His first thought was impossible, but instinctive. A Japanese pilot had stolen an American fighter. He sprinted toward the nearest .50 caliber emplacement, shouting for his crew. 3 men scrambled behind him, shoving the heavy barrel into position. Through the glass of the binoculars, Martinez saw the descending fighter, rocking, swaying, bleeding speed and coming straight for the threshold. But he couldn't fire. Not yet. Not until the last second. Not until he was sure. Above them, Adair's world was collapsing. His head throbbed so violently, he could barely keep his eyes open. Every breath tasted like hot metal and smoke. He had to time it perfectly, roll upright too early, and the damaged controls would force the nose down into the jungle. Roll too late, and he'd overshoot the runway, plowing into trees at 120 miles an hour. 300 yards, 200 feet. Adair rolled Lulu Bell upright. Instantly, the crippled aileron slammed the right wing down. The Warhawk lurched sideways, nose pitching dangerously forward. He countered, with everything the shredded control cables had left: muscle against metal, instinct against physics. The nose wobbled, dipped, rose a wounded bird, fighting gravity in its final flutter. 90 feet above the runway, the ground crew watched in a frozen hush. No shouts, no commands. Just the shriek of metal and the ghostly whoosh of a powerless glide. Then, Lulu Bell dropped the last 90 feet in a 4-second plunge. The landing gear hit first hard. A bone-snapping, spine-crushing 7G impact that forced the struts to their absolute limits. The tailwheel slammed down. The right gear folded with a tortured metallic crack. The wingtip gouged into the concrete. Sparks erupted in a blinding spray as the Warhawk spun 180 degrees in a violent ground loop, skidding backward for 200 feet before coming to a stop in a halo of dust and smoke. For 12 long seconds, nothing moved. Then, the canopy creaked open. Philip Adair stood, or tried to. His legs buckled, and he caught himself against the wing root, gasping, shaking pale beneath a mask of soot. Ground crewmen sprinted to him, helping him down just as Martinez and the fire team reached the nose. They threw the cowling open. What they saw inside barely resembled an engine. Pistons melted, crankshaft, warped connecting rods welded in place, coolant boiled away, oil pan ruptured. Lulu Bell was finished, destroyed. But she had brought her pilot home. Later they counted the wounds she'd taken: 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left, a severed aileron cable, a punctured hydraulic reservoir, 2 destroyed electrical bundles, an engine ruined beyond repair and well past the point of logical survival. And yet, she had flown. Most importantly, not a single bomb had fallen on Denjon. All 24 Sally bombers had turned back. 0 casualties on the ground. 14 C-47s still ready for the hump. A hospital still standing. A lifeline to China still alive. 3 days later, on December 16th, the 10th Air Force interrogated Adair. He described the attack: the inverted climbing the landing without flaps. Flight surgeons tested him and discovered his carbon monoxide levels were still dangerously high proof. He had flown the final 11 minutes of the mission, barely conscious. Any other man would have blacked out. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell himself pinned the Silver Star to Adair's chest. For gallantry in action, when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft, preventing the destruction of critical supply facilities. He flew 95 more combat missions, became an ace, returned home, served 30 years, retired a full colonel. The 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, continued until 1945, claiming 413 enemy aircraft in the air and 147 on the ground. They lost 63 pilots each one, a story of courage nearly forgotten by the wider world. And the P-40 Warhawk. It never earned the fame of the Mustang or the Thunderbolt. It was slower, heavier, often obsolete. But on December 13th, 1943, none of that mattered. Because what mattered wasn't the machine. It was the man. One pilot, one battered fighter, 64 enemies, and a will that refused to break. Some stories survived the war. Some stories deserve to. In the end, what happened over Assam wasn't just a dogfight. It was a reminder of what one determined human being can do when every rule, every instinct, and every reasonable chance says, give up. Philip Adair didn't have the fastest plane. He didn't have backup, and he certainly didn't have luck. What he had was a sense of responsibility so deep it pulled him through fire poison and gravity itself. Stories like his remind us that history isn't shaped by machines or numbers. It's shaped by individuals who decide in one impossible moment that they will not break. If this story moved you the way it moved me, consider subscribing to WW2 Secrets. There are so many forgotten heroes waiting to be remembered, and I'd be honored to tell you their stories.